Thank you very much, John. What John forgot to mention was that tips are accepted and greatly appreciated, so do appreciate that. I would like to start this talk by pointing out that this is a collaboration between me, Mike, and Bennett, and this first 30 minutes or so is me giving a lecture to lay the groundwork for some training tools that Mike and Bennett in particular have been developing over the past few weeks. I'd like to begin my part of the lecture with this phrase, which is, look at your data. Now, I'm guilty of saying this ad nauseum to many different people that have helped without adequately explaining what I mean by this. So sometimes I'll say, if you want to quality check your data, just look at your data, check it after each step, check the raw images, and then I go home and I feel like I did something really good, that I really helped them out. But what happens is that some people obviously don't know what this means, especially if they're new to something like fMRI analysis. So let's unpack a little bit what this means. What we're trying to lay the groundwork for is having people develop a judgment or a taste for what constitutes good data, what constitutes passable data, and what constitutes data that may be a problem and may not even be recoverable in some cases. And it doesn't always exist as yes-no. Sometimes it's on a continuum, and sometimes it actually depends on what your thresholds are for including something. So let me give you an example of a couple of images that were sent to me by Heidi Westerman. So she had a question about whether some of her data were passable or not. If there was a problem, what exactly should she do about it? And if I just looked at one of these orthogonal slices, this one probably looks pretty good. There is a little bit of signal dropout at the very tip of it. Maybe that's something that we could correct for, but by and large, this is something we could probably use, maybe clean it up a little bit. But you look at another slice, another view, and this looks a little bit odd. It looks a little bit more elongated. Now, it could be the case that this is just the way the person's brain is, but we'd have to check it by actually overlaying it on an anatomical scan. So the point I'm trying to make here is sometimes you'll come across some data that doesn't totally look right, and you need to do some investigating, and you need to make sure that it is passable, or if there's something wrong with it, what do you actually do with it? Most of what we talk about when we say look at your data is checking the raw images, because if that's not good, nothing else is going to be good. But to give you another look at what we talk about, when we look at each pre-processing step, let's talk about something like the results from realignment. Very important pre-processing step. This is where you overlay and try to get the best alignment between your anatomical image and your functional images. Now, let me clarify what's going on here. This is from the AFNI viewer. If you've used AFNI, this may look a little bit more familiar. On the background in grayscale, that's the participant's T1 anatomical image. Right? And in amber, this overlay is the functional image. It's the same data here, same data here. They've just used different registration algorithms. This is from Ziad Sah's 2009 paper comparing different co-registration methods. Now, if I were to take a poll, which of these two methods seems like it did the better job if you were to look at those overlays? Who says the one on the left did a better job? Okay. Who says the one on the right? That's totally reasonable. The one on the right seems to have missed a lot of the brain for whatever reason. A lot of signal got cut out, and most people would go with the one on the left. But again, it really depends on what your thresholds are for what you want to include. Because if we do some more investigating, look at this from a different angle, you would see that actually the one on the right aligns the internal structures, such as the sulci and the ventricles, much better than the one on the left. Now, this one still misses a lot of coverage in the orbital frontal areas. Maybe that's something you can fix with something like field map correction, something like that. If that's a region that you are just not interested in at all, maybe this one is going to give you better results for some of these internal structures in the midline of the brain. So again, it depends, and it really comes down to you to do some investigating on what is being optimized at each step. So the purpose of this talk is mainly to give you an introduction to this tool that's going to be showcased by Mike and Bennett, using a program called Papaya, which is a medical image viewer. We also want to emphasize that this is the first step in a multi-part series of QA checks, and we really do want your feedback about this training tool that we're going to present. If you got the email from Cindy, she mentioned that in particular for this part of the seminar, for this part of the symposium, we wanted to get as many of the people who are doing the QA checks as possible. It's great if the PIs are also familiar with what's going on in a lot of these QA checks, but we especially want to develop some institutional memory and training protocols for, say, the lab managers or the RAs or the graduate students who are doing the most QA checks on their data. So we really want to train those who need it the most. Now, when we talk about artifacts, I want to present the two definitions that are used in neuroimaging analysis. The first one is when something is observed in the data that we collect, but it's not actually there in the real world. That's one type of artifact. The second one is when there's something that is actually there, but it's not natural and it's possibly pathological. Just to give you some examples of the former, in this case, this hasn't had any defacing applied to it. This was just something raw off the scanner, a T1 image. You'll notice that the face seems to be completely blacked out. Does anybody have an intuition for why that might be? Sorry? Fillings? Could be. Any other guesses? He's on the right track. Yeah. Sorry, that face? Yes, this person is missing his face. This is actually a permanent retainer issue. So this is something that's not going to be attracted to the magnet. It's not going to be, ripped out of your face or anything. But it will lead to these susceptibility artifacts and signal loss in that region. Now, standards differ. When I used to do my graduate work at Indiana, we would allow people to be scanned if they had a permanent retainer on their bottom teeth. We considered that okay because it didn't lead to any noticeable distortions in any parts of the brain that we were analyzing. Standards may differ from institution to institution. Second one, and Bennett, I don't want to hear your interpretation of what's going on here, but I'll just tell you, this had to do with a hair tie that had some metal in it. So it's not the case that this person actually had a hole in their skull. We just happened to catch it with an image. But it leads to some distortions, and it makes it look as though something is there, but it actually is not. And you see this most of the time with these so-called elongations or blowouts, especially in the orbital frontal cortex in some cases. Now, I want to go over that second definition of artifacts because this, to me, is something that usually doesn't get emphasized enough by the researchers who are doing quality assurance checks. This second case of artifacts, which are things which are actually present in the brain, but which are not natural and possibly pathological. On the left, we have a cavernoma, which is an abnormal collection of blood vessels. And on the right, we have the beginnings of what may be a low-grade hemorrhage. The reason why I encourage everybody to check their data, besides the fact that we need to make sure that our data quality is good, is because you may come across something like this that did not get picked up by the scan technician. I have found 3 of these kind of artifacts in my entire career of doing fMRI analysis. So out of hundreds and hundreds of scans that I've run, I found 3, which is a fraction of a percent. But I found them. And one of them was in one of my friends, and that was a very stressful time for both of us. Turns out she'd been having headaches for about a month, didn't know why. She was in one of my studies anyway, This didn't get picked up by the scan technician. This isn't her image. But she had something that looked like this, a little bit more subtle. But I found it, turned it over to the radiologist, and we got that whole thing taken care of. So it's very important. It's really not just for data quality, but also to make sure that the people are okay. Yeah?
Just as a clarification point, yeah, alignment with their IRB language.
Oh, yeah.
And, another term that they're sort of used as incidental finding.
Incidental finding, yes. Yeah.
The first ones you showed, you don't need to talk to the IRB about. These ones.
Right, exactly, yeah. And be familiar with what the protocol is at your scan center. So they usually do not want you as the researcher to contact the subject directly because it may be something that they really don't need to stress out about. Usually you send it to a radiologist who then takes it out of your hands and makes the call about what to do. So just make sure that you know what the appropriate procedures are. So that's why I bring this up. It's extremely rare, especially because, in my case, I mostly image, healthy younger adults, and the odds that they're going to have something like this are very, very low, but they do happen. Now, luckily for us, there are pretty easy ways to look at a lot of these. And what I recommend, even though I know most people here probably use SPM, is to use a viewer such as Fossilize or Afni's viewer, because they have some easy ways to go through each of the slices for both the anatomical image and also the functional images. So for example, with Fossilize, you can hold down one of the arrow keys, scroll through at a pretty good pace. If you need to slow down, look at something that seemed to be a little bit off, you can go back one slice, forward one slice, and do this through all the different orthogonal views. Pretty easy to use. If you happen to use something such as the Afni viewer, on the other hand, they have something called movie mode, where you simply select one of these orthogonal views, press V to enable video mode. You can alter what the frames are per second as well. You can slow it down, speed it up. And as part of my own check, I do this for all three orthogonal views on both the anatomical images and the functional images at a relatively slow clip, maybe a little bit slower than this. But the point is, if something appears that seems to be a little strange, possibly an artifact of either type 1, type 2, an incidental finding, it should appear pretty clearly on that. So the artifacts I've shown so far, they're pretty obvious. If somebody has a hairpiece, or they have a metal retainer, or something like that sort, usually these are taken care of through proper screening and simply looking at the images in the viewers, slice by slice. However, there are a lot of artifacts which are more subtle, and those are the kinds that we're going to focus on mainly today. They're not always that easy to find, and you really do need to do some investigating and also developing some standards for what you might consider an artifact that has corrupted your data, possibly beyond recovery, or what might be something that you can recover. I'm going to show you a few different ones which are pretty common. And one of them, we call it a motion artifact, and it really does depend on what your thresholds are. Obviously, there is a point at which motion becomes so bad that it can lead to data that's basically useless. So motion artifacts are by far the most common. You can see the subject moving a little bit there. And I want to emphasize that your subject will move. That's basically a given. Okay, so a little bit of motion we can deal with. Too much, it gets into a territory where it's possibly unrecoverable for that run. Now we can do some pre-processing to remove small motion artifacts and set thresholds for how much motion we can tolerate before we either remove just that volume or possibly remove the entire run. They're particularly problematic with resting state data, and although we have tools for mitigating some of the effects, they can still make your data unrecoverable in some cases. Now, spiking artifacts, they sound as though they'd be easily noticeable, but sometimes they are a little bit more subtle. But what you'll notice here, if you can see it, is the whole brain intensity tends to change from volume to volume. which is probably not due to changes in blood flow, but rather possibly some kind of spiking artifact, which usually can be dealt with something like Afni's 3D spike. The last case is something called a hardware artifact, and usually these are things that you can't really do anything about. So in this case, this was a loose radiofrequency connector. And in that case, that's a hardware issue. I don't really know of any ways to recover the signal that was actually there from something that had this done to it. But if you do catch this after you scan that particular subject, it's best to let the scan center know about it so that the next person who scans doesn't run into that same problem. So these are usually pretty obvious. In this case, it just seems like a noisy TV almost. And in that case, you can be pretty sure that it has to do with a hardware artifact and not something else. So just to recap, some of the types of fMRI artifacts. One of them is physiological, so it has to do with motion, heart rate, breathing. And a lot of these we can take care of, within reason. Obviously, if they move, a few centimeters, not a whole lot you can do about that. But on the order of, millimeter or less, we can usually do something about that. As for things like breathing, heart rate, any signs of life, we can usually regress those out by recording those when they're being scanned. The second type, which is a little bit more insidious, has to do with inherent physics. So things like metal, things like susceptibility artifacts. There's something called field inhomogeneities, which we try to account for by acquiring something called a field map. So if it's not part of your scan protocol, I highly recommend getting one because they usually only take a couple of minutes. At least when I was scanning, they didn't take that long. And what they'll do is they'll measure any inhomogeneities in the magnetic field that are caused by the subject simply being in the scanner. You take those, you can unwarp them, and recover signal. The last one, hardware, again, maybe loose connectors, maybe something spiked in the equipment, and in that case, not a whole lot you can do about that. So what we're going to focus on the most about training are these first two, which are physiological and also inherent physics. With the physiological artifacts, one thing that you get from the fMRI lab, also, is anybody new here? Is this anybody's, say, they haven't scanned before, they just started scanning, anything like that? Okay, Ben is an old hand. He's a veteran. So most people will know that the fMRI lab, they'll output these things called flex files because they've already done some of the pre-processing for you. Right? They don't do this at every institution. So what they do is they'll do some of the motion correction. They'll also do physiological correction as well. So just be aware of what they will actually do with your data before they send you the actual files. On the left here, this is called a motion parameter chart, probably familiar to most of you. One thing I want to point out is the scale of these charts. So it may look at first glance that there's a lot of motion going on, but the scale is times 10 to the negative third, so this subject actually hardly moved at all. It's a pretty good subject. And we also have rotations and translations. And one thing that's particularly difficult about motion correction is that, if people just moved right to the left, right to the right, just up, just down, that would actually be pretty easy to control for if they just did that, and if they did that at a steady rate every time that they moved. But because they're not that compliant, usually they're more complex motions that combine both translations and rotations, which is why some people advise including motion derivatives in your model to account for those more complex motions. One question I also get a lot is how much motion is too much? And I really wish I could give you a straight answer for when it's too much and when it's not. Unfortunately, this has been a debate going on for a long time, so the best I can say is it does depend somewhat. To give you the most clear example, if you're doing something such as resting state, people have much stricter thresholds for what constitutes a motion problem than not a motion problem, right? In resting state, if people move, that can induce things called spurious correlations, which, because correlations are usually the whole point of a resting state analysis, that's something you can't have in your data. Also, if you're working with populations such as children, God bless if you do, it's a very difficult population. I do not scan them. But if you do, usually, in my experience, the people who do scan them have a little bit more lenient motion thresholds. I'm seeing some nods. I'm seeing some very traumatized researchers, battle scarred, seeing all kinds of motion. Oh yeah. So in that case, it really depends on what kind of protocol that your lab has written up for what you're willing to deal with. And different fields may have different literatures on what they consider appropriate and what they might be able to do with it. In the case of motion, I'll just give you the rule of thumb that I usually follow, at least when I'm analyzing healthy young adults, is if they move more than the size of a voxel over the entire run, I seriously consider dropping that run, right? Unless for some reason I really can't afford to, or maybe I analyze that run and everything looks super clean. But usually I err on the side of caution and I'll just drop it. If they have a sudden movement that's more than, say, half a voxel, because, say, they've sneezed or they've moved suddenly, that also might be a candidate to remove it. You can try different methods. You can try interpolations. You can try scrubbing. Again, it really is up to you, and it depends on what kind of population that you're analyzing. But in any case, I always say that prevention is the best cure. So if you train the person appropriately, if you have them in the mock scanner, if they're comfortable, if you've taken into account, what their attention span is like for that particular population, you don't make your scans too long, you can get around all of these really fancy pre-processing steps that we do after the fact to try to deal with it. Physiological artifacts are a little bit more straightforward because you can apply something such as a respiratory belt to measure breathing. You can attach something to measure their pulse. And you can try to mitigate some of the effects of these physiological artifacts. This is a figure from a paper looking at the effect of those different artifacts. And notice for the cardiac regressors, it's very, very high in what part of the head or the brain? Seems to be mainly where the entrances of those carotid arteries, right? And if you look at your two images and you look at the time series, you do see these pulsation artifacts. And if that's close to a part of the brain that you're interested in, this is definitely something you want to take care of. Respiratory regressors, where does that seem to be the most severe? More towards the top of the brain, right? Top of the head. Why is that? Breathing, probably moving a little bit more in that direction. Again, this is something usually, I don't know, is this a default that's taken care of by the fMRI lab? Or do they have to ask about it specifically? Or?
So the fMRI lab, I'm sure if everyone knows it, but
This is Scott.
Lab,
Yeah.
records physio, by and large, unless you don't want it, and then implement it in the data. That's more of a study-by-study choice. Some people do use our physio correction, so we do that stage of processing. Others don't, but they still get the physio tracers and have them in case they ever want to use them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but by and large,
Yeah, I mean, I would collect them unless you're on a really tight schedule. You can't afford to take the time to hook them up, but it probably doesn't take that long.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
These are fast, they've got better tech.
Yeah.
Pretty good at doing it without any time cost to you guys. So.
Right.
By and large, I recommend recording them, even if you feel like you don't need to.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in resting state, you should.
Yeah, for sure. Now, these susceptibility artifacts, again, if you see some dropout, particularly in the orbital frontal areas, the more ventral areas of the brain, usually parts of the brain closer to sinuses suffer from this. You can collect this thing called a field map, which maps the inhomogeneities I was talking about earlier in that primary magnetic field. So if you have that, you can do something called unwarping, which conceptually it just applies the reverse of this to this data, and then theoretically you should be able to recover that signal in those areas where it was lost. Works pretty well. I've had pretty good success with it. Again, only takes a couple minutes, at least when I was scanning. I'm assuming it's probably the same here. So I strongly recommend including that in the protocol. Now, some other considerations. Even though so far we've been talking mainly about artifacts and mainly in fMRI data, which is our focus mainly for this day, there are a few other things about quality checks I want to emphasize, which I don't think get emphasized enough. One is to make sure that you have all the files that you need. It's very, very important. All these tricks we do with all the pre-processing, all the field map correction, all the physiological correction, all the motion correction, and it doesn't mean anything at all if your onsets are messed up, let's say. I've seen it happen. More common than you think. Some people will collect an entire study before they even look at whether their onsets were right. And if they're not right, we have a program which can fix all that. That's a joke. You're screwed. You can't do anything about that. So make sure that that stuff is there, because if it's not, we cannot do anything about it. A good way to check for this is to write a checklist of every output that you should be getting from each subject. So if you had, sorry, was there a question? Oh. If you were scheduled to have 6 functional runs, and you only get 5 of those runs from a subject, you need to know why that is. I'm assuming most people here keep some kind of log when they do the scanning, right? Super important. I always have something where I have notes for, was that scan totally went off without a hitch, no problems, just mark that. Did it seem like they were moving a lot? Did they have any complaints? Did we miss a scan for whatever reason? Sometimes there's a hiccup with the scanner. Something happens. You need to make sure that you know exactly what subject has what data and why they do. And this will save you so many headaches down the line. Now, if you need, either me, Mike, Bennett, we all have the skills to write you scripts to check for files, to check for things like headers, the orientation, all that information about TRs, voxel size, make sure that's all consistent. And if it is, usually that makes the rest of your pre-processing a lot smoother. So again, this isn't something that you see in your data per se, but it's every bit as important. The very last thing I want to talk about before I turn it over to Mike and Bennett is to emphasize also that standards do change over time. And every couple of years we get papers that come out, keep us on our toes, make us panic that we've done everything wrong. But we do need to take these seriously because they tend to come up during reviews. I'll just give you a couple examples, some relatively recent ones. This one was a 2014 paper by Jonathan Power. And if you do resting state, he's a researcher you should really be familiar with because he focuses on this stuff very, very closely. And something that he noticed was that even if you did things like interpolating volumes which seem to have too much motion, even if cosmetically it looked like it fixed the problem, if you looked at the properties of the signal versus the noise, the interpolated volumes seem to have a lot of the properties of the residuals as opposed to the actual signal. So cosmetically, it seems to fix everything, but if you take a deeper look, it actually doesn't, unfortunately. So that's a good paper to look at. The other one is a recent preprint that Cindy brought to my attention. Again, want to emphasize this has not been published yet, but I did give it a read through. It is pretty compelling, and I do think it probably will get published eventually. And the Reader's Digest version of this is that we do all of these pre-processing steps, and it's kind of implied in the way that we do it that these things are orthogonal to each other, right? First we do the slice timing, and then we do the motion correction, and then we do the registration, or however you do it. But what they've shown is that they actually are not orthogonal, and that depending on the way that you have this set up, later pre-processing steps can actually introduce artifacts from the previous pre-processing steps. It's a very sobering paper. They do have some recommendations about possibly including one model that tries to account for everything all at once. So it basically accounts for any shared variance between the steps. But if you haven't seen that yet, please let me know. Please let Cindy know, or you could just look on bioRxiv for Martin's latest paper. Okay, so in summary, there are several types of artifacts. There are the ones which, or incidental findings, the ones which could be possibly dangerous, the ones which are not, but which can still affect your data. Also, artifacts are not the only part of quality assurance. Having a good protocol, having good notes, extremely important. And lastly, if you have any questions, please email michiganneihelp@umich.edu, and one of us will help you out. Unless there are any questions, I'm going to turn it over to Bennett with the Papaya Demo. Okay.